Uh, so anyway, so in verse 41, and this is a verse that is very important, Jesus says, had left his disciples to watch the road, and so when he came back one time to see on it, to check on them, and they'd fallen asleep. You know, it was nighttime. He was in suffering, and they were sleeping. You couldn't watch with me for 1 hour, you know, because it was kind of like, you know, until he had done everything that he needed to do in the garden. You know, they were to keep everybody away from him, but they fell asleep. Well, anyway, so Jesus says to them, "Watch and pray that ye enter not into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." Watch and pray that ye enter not into temptation. Okay, and temptation, you see, comes from emotion, comes from feelings, okay? And the idea of praying always so you don't fall into temptation is very important. We always need to be watching and praying so that when there is temptation, that you have the strength of the Spirit not to fall into temptation. And it's actually one of my favorite scriptures. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. And without the support of the Spirit, we fall into temptation very easily. Anyway, so when he had done praying, okay, and this separation from his Father continued from the garden until he gave up the ghost. You see, you know, he went through the hardest part. Hardest part was breaking the connection, but then, even then, his own spirit was starting to reinforce itself to live, because he still wanted to live. Okay, spiritually he still wanted to live, even though he'd already been cut from his Father in heaven. So then the next part of how do you kill a god is to wear the body out to a point that it can die. Okay, so remember, this is nighttime when this is going on. So after he's done praying, well, Judas has already gone and talked to the Pharisees, and so he comes with a group of armed men to arrest Jesus. It's in the garden. And, you know, then we have what he says where he came forth and betrays him with a kiss. And at that point in time, Jesus said unto him, "Friend, wherefore art thou come?" And they came and laid hands on him. But anyway, maybe it's not in this version, but when Jesus talks to him about betraying him, Judas suddenly realizes that he did the wrong thing, and he felt a remorse of conscience. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but the contract that Judas made with the Pharisees was not just to lead the soldiers to Jesus, but he was also supposed to be a witness in the trial. Okay, and that plays into, and I want you to remember that, because when we get to that point in the story, I will bring it up again. Okay, and then we have the part about where Peter cuts off the ear of the servant of the high priest, and then Jesus just picked it up and stuck it back on. I've never done that yet. I've been able to heal wounds rapidly, but I've never had to restore a severed body part before. Um, but anyway, Jesus says, "Thinkest thou that I cannot now pray to my Father, and he shall presently give me more than 12 legions of angels?" Put away your sword. Um, For all they that take the sword shall perish with the sword. We're called to a ministry of peace, not to a ministry of war. And so you live by the sword, you die by the sword. And so then Jesus was taken before Caiaphas, who was the high priest. And bear in mind that according to the Jewish law, the Sanhedrin were not supposed to meet at night. But here it is in the middle of the night, and Jesus is taken before the council in the middle of the night. Okay, and so they had false witnesses come to testify against Jesus, but none of their witnesses agreed. And so like I said, Judas's contract was to stand up in the council as one of his friends, and he was supposed to have, according to his contract, he was supposed to have witnessed against Jesus, saying that Jesus said he was the Son of God, which would have been blasphemy, which would have been the witness that they were looking for to have Jesus executed. You see, just to say that he was the Messiah was no big deal, because there were a lot of people saying they were the Messiah. But to actually speak blasphemy, to say that he was the Son of God, that would have been enough to execute him for them. But Judas didn't show up. Because something that Jesus said to Judas struck him with remorse of conscience. And, we read another place where he tried to give the money back, and they wouldn't take it. Except that they took it to buy a field to bury commoners. Okay. So finally, the high priest, he says, "You've heard all these witnesses. What do you have to say for yourself?" And Jesus is silent. And then finally, the high priest arose and said unto him, "Answerest thou nothing what it is these witness against you?" But Jesus held his peace. And the high priest said unto him, "I adjure thee by the living God that thou tell us whether thou be the Christ, the Son of God." Okay? Now, in other words, he's calling upon Jesus. Jesus is the Son of the living God. He is the living God, right? And so he's saying that by the authority that I have to call upon God, I'm calling upon you to tell us who you really are. Well, in that case, Jesus has to tell him who he really is, and he says, "Tell us whether thou be the Christ, the Son of God." And Jesus answered him, "Thou hast said." Okay, yeah, you said it. I am. He's admitting it. Okay, so Jesus, in the end, was kind of forced to witness against himself. Okay, because Judas wasn't there to do it. All right? And so then the high priest says, "Well, you've heard his blasphemy, now we're going to kill him." And so they all agree to that. And so then they start spitting on him and hitting him. And well, anyway, then we go back to, in the meantime, we have Peter. And we all know the story about how Peter does deny Jesus. And then when the cock crowed, then he recognized what he had done. And then he went and wept bitterly. Okay.